investigations into historical consciousness. The great battle general Montgomery, the English General Montgomery, who never lost a battle either in the First or the Second World War, has said, war is history, and history is built up on war. One could say, so Leo Strauss has said, if we say history in an unqualified way, not history of fashion, not art history, not history of the sciences, but just history, the primary meaning is the history of wars. So this is a largely held sentiment at the core of the light which is awake and guides Western man. So let's look both at as it were, a macro example and a micro example of how history, what the region we call history is. So, first of all, if we have something Marco Polo or Herodotus, this is not really what we're talking about when we talk about history. That's more like some guy that said a lot of things, a lot of which are false, and then we have to sort it out for the facts. And then Herodotus is reporting on a lot of, he's doing historia, he's collecting sort of reports from human beings about what they say, a lot of things about the north wind and the various legends and other things. But when we talk about history, usually we mean something like, so for instance, there are reports about the Crusades. So we see in the first reports about the Crusades, radical despising of the enemy as a kind of rabid beast, not human. And then we see, after about 100 years, we start to see all kinds of reports which then begin to resemble the way the Romans talked about other people. So for instance, Tacitus about the Jews says the Jews, all their habits are different than our habits, almost the reverse of our habits. And then he goes on to, I believe, totally ingenuously, or as it were, naively, he's not doing it deliberately, but just this is the way he projects his own Roman light, the light of the Roman idea, onto the Jews. He says, the man Moses has contrived to make himself king, and this is how he managed to do that. So he attributes to Moses this Roman motivation of wanting to make himself king over the Jews. He absolutely doesn't enter into the life of Moses the way it would be understood by a religious Jew who wanted to ask about what was the greatest of the Jewish prophets, what was happening with him. So that's an example of the light of the Roman idea operating in a way that it informs about history, because it projects in the motives. We see this all the time, every day. Especially I notice this with so-called progressives and Marxists, of assuming a kind of inner life. So it's a kind of racism, assuming a kind of inner life of the other group, and then depicting them this way. So the Chomsky is an extreme example of that, always pointing to the greed and avarice and the nastiness of the capitalist and so on, and never considering the notion in the light of the way they understand it themselves, in the best cases of saying, here's this free enterprise system. Here, let's say Hayek, for instance, say Milton Friedman, even better. Obviously, a man who liked his fellow human beings, generous man who had good motives, but had a different view. So projecting the motive is part of historical consciousness, and this is something which can awaken in people and change. So how much is this possible? What I just said about the Crusades, can we superimpose that then on the current situation with the, as it were, total war or war of material attrition, which is appearing in the Ukraine? Now let me give another example of what's meant by this fate of the historical consciousness and of how ideas seize upon human beings and then act as the light for guiding us. And also, let's say how, so remember, Nietzsche has cited Bertold Niebuhr, sometime writing around 1850 or so, that said the only lesson to be drawn from history among thinking people is the total arbitrariness of the ideas that guide us, that take control of us. They simply befall us. So, for instance, now I don't know if this is totally accurate, but it has a verisimilitude. So, one idea that was at the beginning of the 19th century, around the French Revolution, starting to light people up, was this idea that was later made famous by Jakob Burckhardt, the colleague and friend of Friedrich Nietzsche, trying to look at history from the point of view of ordinary people, rather than what I just said about the history is built up by war, primarily. Balzac has produced novels under the idea of a kind of verisimilitude, so that one can show history in its great details by showing something that's more or less realistic and then getting into the details. So I have an example that may be actually perfectly factual, but I'm just not totally sure. So there's a person that I know that's Trump supporter, staunch Trump supporter, and who finds in some way himself at home in the sphere of Tucker Carlson, finds Tucker Carlson's interpretation of the world somewhat congenial. So I believe, I know that Tucker Carlson came out with a statement recently, which is a statement which, the basic thrust of it, we could see in Dostoevsky's Betsy, and we could see already permeating the 19th century in Germany, but which is somewhat new to certain sections of the American consciousness. And the idea is basically that to show very directly and very clearly that through the presentation of facts, through the selection of the facts, that we can create different impressions, especially with the media. And so Tucker Carlson has come out with a very direct statement of this, and it's had an effect, I believe, on this person. So being an intelligent observer, once this, so this person probably already had heard of this, but once one hears it and it seizes upon one maybe because of the source, maybe because of how clear it's stated, but for whatever reason, once it starts to light up in them, then they see, for instance, things, connections, so that, the idea that AI could be racist, for instance, so recent articles about that, due to its programming, or the idea that the newspeak in Orwell, that the language can be used in such a ways that we can't discuss certain matters. So I mentioned to this person something which I believe before they had watched that Carlson video, they certainly would not have been as ready to accept, but they accepted it immediately without further ado, as a matter of course. The example of the newer people of the sub-Saharan Nihic people or Nile people who don't have a word for time in general. So if you don't have a word for time in general, you can't discuss time in general, right? So the newspeak we could understand. Once we have the light of this idea of the selection of the facts controlling how we interpret the world, or controlling how we take the facts, then we can see right away that through changing language so that we can only discuss certain things, we don't have a word for time anymore, then we can't discuss time in general. We don't have a word for justice. Say we don't have a word for decay or justice, as arose first in the 6th century BC, then we can't have a public discussion about justice. So but through the selection of our concepts and the light they give us, we can then have different conversations which we couldn't otherwise have without them. So this person was very open to accepting this, and I think it's precisely because simply through this river of history, this history rolling down its great burden in this radically mysterious dispensation, it so happened that this idea has now become the latest thing for Tucker Carlson, and therefore heightened in its power for certain people who find that sphere congenial, find that sphere more like Heimat, more like home, more at home in that sphere. Remember, Hegel has said the ultimate goal of history is to be at home. So people want to be where they're not embarrassed, where they're not where they feel their abilities, they're free to use their abilities, where they're not dependent on others, and so on, where they feel most at home and most congenial. That's where history is supposed to take us, according to Hegel, more and more at home. But does it do that, or is it simply this continual, radically mysterious dispensation of different awakenings, so that our existence, so that our ideas, so that our sentiments, so that our inclinations, so that our habit of dwelling is constantly in a flux, as Nietzsche believes. So that's the simple core, and that's the micro example of a person being awakened to an idea in some sense. Yes, they may have heard of it already. Yes. So that's the other thing. I think this is what the second part of this. So let's end the first part of this discussion and start the second part. The second part is, what about the innumerable cases where we grow into a world where there's ideas which we hear of, but we don't, they don't really light us up. They don't really light our thinking in the way that we see the connections constantly once they have truly stirred in us, once they have truly seized on us. This is, so I differ, this is the main point I differ, I think, with Dugin on, is that Dugin thinks Das Man in Heidegger is simply a word for something evil, as against the Eigentliche or the authentic. But I think what it means is everything that's active, which is only lukewarm, which is only half active, and therefore it has a power over us. We respond to it, but we don't really see it, and we can't, so we don't face up to it. It hasn't lit up for us, and therefore we can't either accept it and go with its stream. We can't accept it and see through its lens, but instead it's just there as an annoyance in a way. This is Das Man, is what everyone's doing already in the background that we've inherited, but it's not really truly on, as Strauss would put it this way, as standing on our own 2 feet. We can't either accept it or not accept it, because we haven't really faced up to it. And maybe the reason we haven't faced up to it is merely arbitrary, because the right historical rapids haven't drawn us into the river. The right din of historical discussion of clear, lucid, and unusual new ideas has not crescendoed in our ear. And so not having that, we're just stuck in the halfway house. We're stuck in being under the influence of the ideas, but not actually being able to tackle them, to accept or reject them, to take control. So this is also true of things that we might be very feel improve us and feel give us the light of intelligence, real genuine light of intelligence, but we simply don't come across it in a way that it speaks to us. And then that's what the lack of the Eigenlichkeit, or the so-called authenticity means. So I totally differ from Dugin in the sense of I don't think that's something either evil or good. As Heidegger says, this is simply an observation of our Dasein, of how it functions. And in a way, it's radically unclear how to settle that, except that I think this is why, the original notion of philosophy in the West seemed to be a way to awaken out of the Das Man attitude of kind of like half knowing, the supposing oneself to know, and go towards the through the method. So I think it's just a means of the I know that I don't know, to then clear out and say I know that I don't know until I actually face up to an idea. So I think, so for instance, in the case of Socrates, if there was a politician and he's, in order to maintain his authority, he's saying, well, I know what, let's project it to the current period. He says something like, yes, I know that we have a tripartite government. We have Article 1, legislature, Article 2, executive, Article 3, judiciary. And then it would be totally inappropriate if Socrates would rush in and say, but you think that you know that, but you don't really know that. No, he does know that. But if he were to go on and say, but I also know that this is the true form of government, and that it's not worthwhile to consider whether or not there could be some other form of government. There could be an improvement. This could be in some way a mistake. This could be causing actually problems that we don't know about. No, this is the truth. That's, I think, where the Das Man becomes poisonous, because then it's stultified. Then it's like a frozen structure, like plaque. It becomes like neuronal plaque. But then that's where the I don't know that I know is appropriate. I think it's where you take what's received wisdom, what's supposed to be the truth, and which, as a matter of convention or law, is the truth, because we actually do have that tripartite government. But then you ask whether, or let's say it this way, it's de facto the case, but then you ask whether it's true, whether it's the ultimate and final dwelling of our Dasein, whether we should stay with it. And the only way to actually face up to that is to not know for a while. It's to make these comparisons, is to put yourself in the position of these second chroniclers of the second 100 years of the Crusades, who then started to act more like the Roman picture I gave of the Tacitus drawing comparison. So what I want to say with that is, when Tacitus, even if he might have projected a lot of things on the Jews, at least he compared them to Romans and said, okay, here's another dwelling, here's another set of ethos, here's another way they're doing things, they're human, we're human, something like that, rather than what's happening now in the case of American elites with respect to, say, Putin, or respect to the radical Russite, the anti-Russite or anti-Russite sentiment, that basically Putin is evil, simply evil, and that we can't have any question of a comparison. But are we, one, is this pattern in history what's actually happening? And two, how so far are we to become awake to this situation? And let's pose one more question. Is Hayek has said something along the lines of America's moving at a 70-year delay from the historical consciousness of the Europe and of the German sphere. And so is it possible that this awareness of these Nietzschean problems will actually become genuinely grab and shake our intelligence, shake the way we make decisions? And this whole theme is really ought to open sort of the door to what Hegel means by philosophy of history, because it's the idea that our ideas, the light with which we see things, are a genuine subject of scientific study of reality, which cannot, which in a certain way is not a phenomena, which in a certain way is not something we can have an experiment on because it's too close to us, but we can only sort of discuss it as an after effect, as though we distance ourselves from it.